Right. So welcome everyone to another Dolphin Communication Project webinar. We have a deep dive this evening after our summer hiatus, and we're not going to really talk about dolphins at all. But as we believe, dolphins are not the only important creature in the sea, and it is important that we learn about and protect everything in the ocean. So today's topic is Goliath Grouper. And we are joined by Dr. Christopher Malinowski. Very happy to have him here and his expertise. His education has taken him from, I think, Wisconsin to Florida State to Purdue, and then he just missed Kathleen and DCP in Connecticut, but then our paths crossed in Florida. So we are going to pass it over to you, Chris, and we are excited for your.
So thank you for that introduction. Like Kel said, Dr. Chris Malinowski. I've been studying Goliath Grouper now for about 10 years. But I have a history before that, starting with my master's, which was in marine mammal biology, which I had to put one slide in here for this at least, just to show that I have made a switch. I started with fish ecology in undergrad, switched over to marine mammals for my master's, then back to fish for my PhD and into my postdoctoral work, and now into my after career. And yeah, it's interesting. I think we look at all these model species, and so that everything's interested in the ocean. It's not just one thing or the other. You know, we really look at these things as sort of icons or iconic species to try to understand dynamics that are happening all the way throughout the oceans and freshwater and whatever. So it's been interesting to transition into different organisms that I've worked on. But today, of course, we're going to focus on my work that has been largely on grouper and Goliath Grouper. And that's where I will start off this presentation. I want to start by just showing a list of people acknowledgements, and there's more than this too. This is probably an outdated list, but a lot of people have gone into the work that I'm going to present today, from tons of volunteers, collaborators, and advisors and colleagues. So this work is not just my own. What I really want to highlight is these 4 points. So if you remember nothing else from my talk, remember these 4 points. So there's a lot of controversy for those of you that are not familiar, and I'll get into this today during my talk, surrounding Goliath Grouper, particularly in the state of Florida, but their conservation is really a big issue throughout their range. And these are 4 main points that we made recently to the FWC, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission, on reasons why we really need to shift the paradigm away from considering fish as those that should be targeted for harvest, to a paradigm towards a non-consumptive use of resources. And then so this is really what I want to focus on today as I discuss research that I've partaken in and led on the species. And so those 4 main points that we have highlighted in publications and really condensed down to a letter we wrote during the May meeting are that the public perception that Goliath Grouper are invasive and destroying habitat is flawed. High mercury concentrations is a big issue in the species, and they present severe consequences to Goliath Grouper and to humans that consume them or that potentially would consume them. Recruitment to the adult population is limited. So those new individuals that are starting off as young and growing into the reproductive adult population, it's limited. And then lastly, viable alternative economic considerations have not been addressed. So this is really the main things that I'll come to, and I'll point out which I'm discussing as I get to it. So I wanted to start with a little bit of biology of grouper, especially for those of you that are not familiar with fish as much as you are marine mammals. And they have numerous characteristics across the board that are unique to grouper, but also that increase their vulnerability to overfishing. So in general, across the world, there's 163 species. So much different than if you go to a restaurant and you order grouper. It's usually, you don't necessarily know what grouper you're getting. It could be any number of species. Out of the 163, but just know that there's a lot of species that contribute to that category of grouper, and there's 22 that are in the West Atlantic itself, which is our region here in Florida on this coast, on the East Coast. So importantly that they're slow growth, they have slow growth, late maturity, and they are very long lived. And so this basically amounts to slow production rates. They don't add a lot to the population until, for example, Goliath Grouper don't mature until around age 7. And so it takes them that long to even start to add back to the population. And Warsaw Grouper, another large grouper, 9 years, and Gag, a popular commercial fishery, 5. So those are just examples. So that's a big consideration. Most form spawning aggregations, which means they collect to areas during certain times of year for the purpose of reproduction. And those are often utilized by fishers and target because they're easy targets. They're done year after year. There's a lot of repeated aggregations. And once those behaviors are recognized, you can target them very well. And they have been targeted by fishers. And that is a big reason for the decrease or decline in a lot of grouper populations, because that's hitting them at a very vulnerable point in their life history as well. Many use estuaries, nearshore estuaries, so coastal environments as nursery habitat. For example, Gag use seagrass for 6 months. Goliath Grouper use mangrove habitats for 5 to 6 years, for the first parts of their lives. So they become very important to the overall success of populations. And of course, many of these coastal environments, as estuaries, are heavily impacted by human activities, which we'll get into. So, importantly, as I mentioned earlier, we often consider grouper as a fishery species or as a group to consume. And as such, if you date back on the x-axis is years and metric tons is usually how these are measured in terms of fishery productivity, you see this increasing line over time. And basically that represents the commercial take, but also recognizing that populations are decreasing over time, and this is inflated because a lot of the gear and ability to target fisheries increased over time. But this represents the amount of food that's being taken over time. But of course, Goliath Grouper, I'm going to get into now, have been out of that fishery since 1990, and they're currently protected. And so in terms of Goliath Grouper and understanding their distribution as a species, not necessarily as a food species, but as a species that's important to the ecosystem, it's important to understand their distribution. So historically, they have ranged from Florida in this upper arrow in the Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico down the Atlantic to South Brazil. And there used to be Goliath Grouper over in the western coast of Africa, but that is now thought to be no longer existent. They're thought to be extinct there. There hasn't been a Goliath Grouper reported there in many years. And some genetic work has recently reclassified Goliath Grouper as a separate species in the Pacific. So really what we're dealing with today is this population in Florida. This is really the epicenter of their population. Nowhere throughout their range are they in the abundance that they are here. I've done work in Brazil and colleagues out throughout their range, and it's really in Florida where they've shown this some recovery since early near extinction rates. So here it just shows a map and it shows the depth bathymetry, but what's important here is just to recognize that these are the areas where we know that they aggregate to spawn, and this is based on research that has mostly come out of our lab. And so you can see they're sort of at a similar latitude between the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico, and then a recent site we identified up in the northern Gulf of Mexico. And just to talk a little bit about Goliath Grouper life cycle, which is very similar for most grouper. So starting from those spawning aggregations where they all collect as reproductive adults in large numbers, they release eggs and sperm into the water column, and that acts to fertilize those eggs. And from there, they become juvenile individuals, larvae, and they last in the pelagic zone in the open water column for 30 to 80 days before they then eventually end up in coastal habitat, mostly mangrove leaf litter, as new recruits, little small larvae after 80 days. And then they last there, move into prop roots of the mangroves until they're about 5 or 6 years old. They eventually move then as subadults or adults into the offshore adult population, then contributing to the spawning population. So that's the overall life cycle and the kind of this species in many grouper. So just to highlight that mangroves are essential for juveniles. It's essential habitat, meaning that without it, they wouldn't exist. So Goliath grouper spend about 5 to 6 years in red mangrove particular habitat. This is from a paper by colleague and my PhD advisor, Chris Koenig et al. And they really showed that the best mangrove habitat that remains in Florida that produces Goliath grouper is in Southwest Florida. A lot of mangrove has been lost throughout the rest of its range in Florida. And it's really in this 10,000 island region here and in the Everglades region. So this is a very important point for recruitment of the species. And of course, in this habitat, as many of you may know, water quality and the way that water flows through South Florida to get to these estuaries is very important. So water quality is extremely important, not only for Goliath grouper, but for all the species that live in these habitats and seagrasses and the mangroves. And of course, you need oxygen in that water and salinity to a certain level in order to survive. And juveniles happen to be a little bit more tolerant of low salinity than adults, but they generally require over 5 PSU. And to relate that back to open ocean, it's about 35 PSU in units. So it's pretty much fresh water that they can live around, but they need higher salinities to do that. So the freshwater flow through Florida really does matter for the species. So their conservation timeline starting in 1990, when they were noticed that they needed protection because they were fished near extinction levels. They were offered full protection. And then starting in 1991, they were actually listed as a candidate for listing under the endangered species. And because of signs of the recovery, they were eventually removed from that list in 2006. Not to say that they are doing great, but that the requirements and legal obligations of the Endangered Species Act didn't allow for them to continue on that process. Other parts of the range in the Caribbean in 1993, they were offered the same protection. In 1994, if you're familiar with the IUCN, International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which is the global authority for species status. So they were listed as critically endangered then, but recently, again, because of some signs of recovery in Florida, pretty much only, they were put back to vulnerable, just one listed one level down from critically endangered. But that's not to say they're out of the woods. There's some consideration to put them back up to critically endangered as of recent red tide events. And so they're currently considered overfish. Harvest is prohibited. And for those of you who have followed what's been going on with this fishery or potential fisheries, in May of this year, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, FWC, directed staff to draft an initial proposal to outline specific regulatory guidelines for a limited fishery. So there's a lot of pressure to reopen this fishery at this point, and it's likely in next month that there's a proposal that will be given to the commission to decide on whether or not we're going to open up a fishery for this. And then there's additional unknown threats to their health and sustainability, which I'll get into. So I just want to give you a little bit of field view of what it looks like to work on this species. So so this is in the juvenile mangrove habitats. We pull the fish out. We work on them lethally, keep them in good condition while we work on them on the boat. And of course, there's other predators and things and species that require this habitat too, like these sharks. And for reference, this is my father here who has caught his first bull shark. He's pretty excited in this photo. And so now moving offshore to the adult population, this is what it looks like. So we use hand lines. Actually, it's easier than fishing poles to pull them in, and then basically do a tug of war contest with them to pull them into the boat. And you can see here from this photo that even some biologists who are not the best at fishing compared to commercial fishermen can pull up pretty much as many Goliath groupers as we can catch in a day to sample. And so there's 3 shown here. So this just goes to show that if a fishery is open, it could be extremely damaging to their population very, very rapidly. They're very easy to target. And so when we pull them on the boat, same as the juveniles, we take good care to keep them in good condition. We strap them down so they don't hurt themselves on the boat while they're moving around, while we're sampling. We put a towel over their eyes to protect them from the sun, their gills, everything to keep them alive and in good health on the boat. I'm just going to run through a couple of very basic things that we sample here. We collect their diet here. You can see another research biologist here reaching her arm into the stomach of a Goliath grouper. This is how we extract diet contents or the prey that they've been eating. So it's kind of a it's always a crowd pleaser to show these photos, but that's how we get the diet from the adults. We extract their fin rays, as you can see here in this top photo, which is a non-lethal way to look at their age, as opposed to the more commonly used lethal way to look at age in fish, which is taking an ear stone out called an otolith. And what you can see is that basically, like counting rings on a tree, you can count the age of a fish this way. And in Goliath Grouper, when we do this, within less than a year, you can see that their tissue grows over that area of extraction, and they do just fine. Blood is an important collection for the studies that we do. The blood itself can show us a variety of things, from levels of toxicants like mercury, blood cell counts to look at their health related to toxicity and other health stressors. And then we can also spin that blood down and use the plasma, much like if you bring a dog into the vet and you run a panel of health parameters to look at how their levels of proteins and immune system parameters are functioning. We can do the same thing with fish. So that was a big thing that we've done. Collect their gonads, like this pump here, to look at reproductive state, and also to look at to collect those from mercury and other concentrations. We collect from the fillet tissue, which is important because this is really what I'm going to talk about with mercury today. We use their muscle tissue, the same component that we consume when we eat fish fillets, and we can use that to look at the amount of mercury and also incorporate their diet in long-term using stable isotopes. So we can get a lot of information from their tissues. And then we also put acoustic tags in many of the fish to look at the movement patterns. And this is just showing a small suture where a little pinger was inserted to track their movement throughout reefs. So here is some of the results then from the data. So this is first looking at reproduction or spawning patterns. So again, moving back to those aggregations where adults all come together for the sake of reproduction. And this shows more precisely than the map I showed you earlier, data on where these spawning aggregations actually occur. So on the East Coast, in Palm Beach County, where I currently am, is the most accessible population. This is really the area that's causing the most controversy because people have the most interaction with them in this area, and they can easily dive on them and fish on these wrecks, etc. So that's important. In the Gulf, they're a little bit farther ashore because of depth requirements. And then we've recently found this aggregation up in the northern Gulf of Mexico, which could indicate that they're expanding their spawning aggregations, or just it's one that has not been identified up until recently that was already there. And this is a cool photo that was taken a couple weekends ago of me diving, and you can see these fish they're large, but they're also very good at conserving energy. So here's a berm in the sand with a very strong current, and the Goliath Grouper are all lined up and really just trying to stay out of the current to conserve energy. And it was cool because I sat there and just kind of watched them for a while myself, trying to get out of the current. And so this is what it looks like on an actual spawning aggregation. Man, it's a charm. Okay, well, here's a picture of an aggregation since video's not working. And the cool thing I wanted to show you here is the fish that we sampled to show the non-lethal nature is that this is just taken of the same aggregation we worked on, and those arrows are pointing at areas where we extracted fin rays. So just showing that they're back in the population. And also if you're diving in these sites, you can probably see some of these individuals that we've worked on. So I want to show you this figure because this is cool. It's a very clear photo, or a very clear figure that shows their recovery patterns. This is again from a paper we published in 2017. So starting back in around the time of their protection, so 1990 was a protection. So showing from there, if you increase up, you can see that on the x-axis is year, and on the y-axis is mean number of individuals, that you see this clean increase in numbers, and the black bars that are bigger represent individuals increasing during the spawning season versus the gray bars, which is the non-spawning season. And those non-spawning season individuals are residents on the reef year-round. But this just shows a clear connection between their recovery and growth in their population up through at least 2012. I'll show you figures in a little while that shows that actually that's starting to drop back down now, kind of challenging their protection, or their recovery rather. And so some of the clues other than just abundance that we look at to identify spawning aggregations is really cool. We can identify this in numerous ways. Another way to back this up to make sure we have a spawning population, again, because, or I guess I didn't mention that fish also in grouper aggregate for feeding and other things. So to really identify that they're increasing for reproduction, we have to look at their gonads, their reproductive organs, or their oocytes, their eggs. So here is a photo on the left of basically when we extracted their eggs, like I showed you in the field photo. You squash this on a slide and you can look at it under a microscope and identify the stages of reproduction. So here showing 2 stages. On the left is hydrated oocytes, the individual eggs, and they increase in volume and become hydrated right before, about 24 hours before eggs are spewed out into the water column to be fertilized, and this adds buoyancy so they can travel the water column. And the figure on the right, or the image on the right, is showing POFs, or post-ovulatory follicles, which is what's left over after the egg is released. It's the nutritive layer on those oocytes, and so that then disappears within about 24 to 48 hours. So both of those are really good signs that reproduction was either about to happen or just happened. And on the right side, these figures show a very clean representation that we also know that this species spawns on new moon nights, so the darkest nights of the reproductive season. So from August to about October, when they're aggregated to spawn, they're specifically targeting these dark nights. And we think that's happening because of all these egg predators called SCAD or cigar minnows, as they're often referred to, that surround them, likely are eating their eggs as they're spewing them out. So if they do this on dark nights, it gives the eggs more of a chance for success. So that's what we think, but the clues are very clear that they are doing this on new moon nights, which you see from this big bar right on that dark moon, as opposed to the other quarters and in the full moon. And other evidence for this too, as would be expected, we also listen to the sound they produce. So these fish are really cool. They're soniferous, meaning they make sounds. They produce these very iconic booms. It feels in your body like a sonic boom. Anyone who's dived with them can recognize this, because you don't just hear it, you feel it through your bones, through your body. And what they do is, you can see on the figure on the top left, where that arrow is pointing, is they produce these booms, these single pulses of energy through the water that can actually be detected and recorded. And you can see that on the right figure 2, figure B. It just shows that energy that's coming up and down and then sort of trailing off. And on the bottom left, we know that these are, or what you feel too, is these low frequency production. So in about the 52 or the 10 to 100 hertz range. So just a very low, like deep frequency that they produced. And they do this really rapidly on new moon nights. So not surprising with all the other stuff I showed you. On here, you see these red bars that's on new moon nights opposite of those open circles, which represent full moon. And so these peak during new moon, and they just, all the individuals are sort of in a chorus during this time, and that attracts mates and allows for successful mating, right? And what you see too is they're also doing this during the middle of the night, at the darkest parts of the night, so midnight to about 5 a.m. They're doing this. So every one of those bars is a single night. So that's pretty cool. Another really important aspect is that they also, because they're coming to these spots, specifically in Palm Beach and the Atlantic side, which is really representing their entire population on this coast, we know that they can move at least about 500 kilometers from about South Georgia on down to these sites, which we've tracked. This is work primarily by Bob Ellis in our lab, where we put these acoustic pingers in them, as they call them. They release a signal and they're picked up on receivers that are deployed, and so we can track their movement patterns, and that's what we found. And so they come to these sites from pretty far away, and then after the spawning season, they move back to their residence sites, wherever those are. And not surprising, we see patterns with new moon. So this is data from 2 years early on in the study, 2011, 2012, where what you see in those peaks and in those dark new moons is that they're coming back. Their signals are being detected on these spawning. This is from one spawning site. Their signals are being detected at a higher rate on those new moon nights. So they're coming to those sites and they're being detected as being present there at a higher rate during the new moon, during the spawning season. So I think I've pretty much made my case for new moon spawning. But it's cool to see all this come together, and the picture is very clear. Okay, so now I've given you a bit of a background on some of that research. I want to get into these points that I brought up at the beginning, these 4 points. So the first one I'm going to discuss is the public perception that Goliath grouper are invasive and destroying habitat is flawed. All right, so stemming back, you can pretty much find opinions by a lot of people, especially angry fishermen or spear fishermen, that they don't like Goliath grouper, and this is one of the reasons why. These are quotes you can find in just about any newspaper where they've been given a voice. And these are also a lot of the individuals that are pushing for this fishery to be reopened. So opinions that are not based on science, but are based on opinion and emotion. Things like they have pretty much taken over the reefs. They have become a nuisance. There should be some sort of a harvest on them. Something needs to be done. It's horrible. These are fishing guides, charter captains, right? They'll eat permits, anything that's easy, anything that's smaller than them, etc. And so these were just a few rare or random examples, not rare, random examples I pulled out of newspapers. Okay, so what does the science actually show? And so this is data on what they actually eat. So they're not eating everything on the reefs, and we know this. And what this figure, I tried not to put a lot of figures in here, but some of them I have to show the data. On this one, so this is for juveniles, and I'll show you separately next on adults. So the y-axis is percent mass, and the x-axis is the percent occurrence of prey that they've consumed. And these are common metrics that are measured in diet and prey. And what you see, what should stand out, is that in the top right corners are crabs, right? This is primarily their diet. So the things that are highest in occurrence in their diet and weigh the most overall. And so crabs are primarily the diet in Goliath grouper, and here we show in juveniles. And then there's other things that accumulate in their diet too, and these are again in mangroves, so things like other fish, shrimp, toadfish, etc. So things in the bottom left corner are more rare, things in the top right are more prevalent. So now moving into the adults, which is really where the controversy arises with what people think they're eating. Well, it should stand out again that you see crabs, right? I put a couple pictures here from that I took from their diet samples to show it. Examples of this, and these are mostly benthic crabs, shamefaced crabs, swimming crabs, things that are pretty slow moving, because as I showed you, that Goliath grouper like to conserve their energy. They're not fast moving fish. They're not like tunas that hunt down their prey. They're sit and wait predators, and they dig in the sand to get a lot of their prey. That's how their physiology is made up in their anatomy. So primarily what they're eating, but of course on reefs, they have access to more prey. They're opportunistic predators. And so you get a wider range of prey in the adults and the juveniles. So scad I mentioned earlier as egg predators, where they also consume these as part of their prey. So and probably because they're around them all the time, they swarm them and use them as habitat. Birdfish is another common one that they consume, and then a plethora of other things that are in smaller amounts. But that's the main point I want to make here. Of course, these interactions that are so negative for many fishers become prominent in their gut. So this isn't their diet data, but showing that they actually interact with a lot of this fishing gear too, and this lasts forever once it's in their system. So if a fish has gulped in fishing line or hooks or sinkers or whatever, it will likely show up in their guts when we reach into it, or in their mouths. And then we do our best to cut a lot of that out and to remove a lot. And here's an example of some bad scenarios where the top left photo is one we took, and this has happened in a lot of fish. This is just a big mass of it. This fishing line has multiple hooks, multiple lines and sinkers. This was actually preventing fish from getting down into its gut. So this is like a net that was created in its mouth, right? So it's a lot worse for these fish than it is for the fishermen who lost a fish to bring home to eat. These fish are actually like dying from this, right? And in the bottom right is a fish we pulled up. That's its throat. That's basically cut. This fish is still alive. It's just not doing well. This was likely a foul hook, and somebody powered through it and ripped out their throat basically. And so you can imagine fish or whatever they consume, crabs are hard to keep and get into their gut. So bottom line is that yes, there's a lot of interaction with fishers, which is where the negative controversy comes from, and the misperception that they're eating everything on the reefs. But these are opportunistic predators like sharks and other things that will eat something that if it's dangling in front of them on a fishing pole or a spear. It's just the nature of opportunistic predators in the ocean. So another important concept that you may have heard of is the shifting baseline syndrome, and this has been written about and documented since the beginning. But this is certainly the case with Goliath grouper and what's happening with a lot of the people that are utilizing resources in Florida for fishing right now. And the concept is that older fishers welcome the recovery of this native species, whereas the younger fishers that are ignorant of historical abundance perceive this fish as an invasive species. So which is obviously not the case. This species has been a part of this ecosystem since Florida has really become an environment for them. So millions of years. And they're not an invasive species to be compared to something like the lionfish, which is, and does actually wreak a lot of havoc on the reef systems. And so here's a figure. I'll explain it briefly, and then I'll show you an animation to drive the point home. But really what I want you to show, what I want to show you here is that we know that Goliath grouper are not a negative impact on the reefs, but actually have a positive impact, being that they are ecosystem engineers, and from their actual movement in and out of reefs, they create more habitat for reef fish. And so this is a paper, again, published by Koenig et al. From our lab in 2011, showing that on the x-axis on all these figures is Goliath grouper density. So the number of Goliath grouper on these sites, compared with on the y-axis on the right side is number of individuals, which is just the overall individuals of fish on those reefs, so like snapper, reef fish. And so you see this line increase, which means that as Goliath grouper increase, so do the number of reef fish. Okay, on the left side is the species richness, which is a really important metric on reefs, which shows the number of species that are on reefs. That's like the gold standard of recovery of reefs, or of trying to understand it, is the more diverse a reef is, the more species rich, the better it is. And then again, you see that as Goliath grouper numbers increase, so does species richness. So they have a positive effect, and that's really a point to drive home. And so here's an animation just showing that. So the more Goliath grouper, the more snapper or reef fish, and then that's been documented. Okay, so the second, moving on to the second point, and I might have to work through this pretty quickly because I think we lost a bit of time. But it's that high mercury concentrations present severe consequences to Goliath grouper, and potentially that would consume them if this fishery were to reopen, right? And in the research that we've done on this, we've had all aspects of this, from how they're getting into their systems and eating it, to how it's circulating through their different tissues in their body, to how they're actually getting rid of it. And I'll talk about the last part, and also how, and I'm really going to focus on just muscle tissue for this talk, because it's most relevant to consumption of the species. So I just want to give you a quick background on mercury in the system, because a lot of you may not really understand how this cycles, and it's a very complex cycle that people spend their entire lives trying to understand, and it's really complex. So so what I was just saying here, I was trying to give you an idea of what the cycle of mercury is like, and how it eventually gets into Goliath grouper. So it gets methylated, which is the worst form of mercury. It's the most toxic form that you've heard of. It's the form that really has health effects on humans and animals alike. And that really happens in the bottom layer of the ocean once it rains down from atmosphere. All right, and then that biomagnifies up. So you may have heard that term, just meaning that as it goes up layers of food web to top predators, mercury concentrates more and more and more into those top predators. Goliath grouper happen to be, from our research, they're like mid-level predators. Basically, I showed you the figure on what they eat, mostly crabs. So because they're long-lived, they tend to bioaccumulate a lot of mercury. And this is also where a lot of the interaction with birds and predators from outside the ocean, and then humans consume fish as well. So this is the interaction. It's the stuff that bioaccumulates in the ocean, and then eventually accumulates and then gets consumed outside of that by predators. And so this is a figure showing, again, from a publication in 2019, that in concern for human consumption of this, the bottom red line is basically showing EPA, Environmental Protection Agency's level of concern for risk of consumption. So they recommend, as a health entity of the environment, also the Department of Health has the same level, that you don't consume fish above that line, right? So you can see from here, total mercury is on the y-axis, up and down. Age and also length shows the same thing. So as the fish get bigger and older, they accumulate more of this mercury, right? And so and I drew this line between juveniles and adults too, just to show where that lays on this map or on this figure. But almost 90+% of the individuals measured have mercury concentration above the healthy level that should be consumed. So automatically that should take this out of food consumption fish. And I'll show you some comparison with other species. But I also want to show you that, it matters where these fish are caught from, not just the size of them, not just the species, but also where. And this is for, again, I use Goliath grouper mostly as a model species to understand how mercury and other things are affected in the environment. So here we can show that mercury is much higher on the East Coast. This has been documented in other publications on other fish too, but we showed this on the East Coast of Florida being a hot spot for mercury, right? So all these yellow boxes are where mercury levels were significantly higher than other regions. So we basically see that most of the highest levels of mercury are coming from the Atlantic coast, with the exception of one up in northern Tallahassee, or up in the Tallahassee region, northern Gulf of Mexico. We've got theories on why those are higher, but really, we'll focus on the ones that are circled here because those are the ones that are really in interaction with people that want to consume them. And so the main thing that we think is happening here is that there's waste incineration plants that are popping up everywhere in Florida. So there's point source. So that I showed that diagram of how mercury goes into the atmosphere. Well, if it's closer to that source, it's more likely to be concentrated in that area. And there's a lot of sources of mercury in this region. It's also that area right outside on the East Coast there is right outside the affluent of the St. Lucie River, and a lot of urbanization that would contribute to the correct environment that would allow for that methylation of mercury to create that toxic form that can then accumulate in the food web. So there's an interaction with the environment and also sources of mercury that provide that spatial region on the East Coast to have high mercury concentrations. All right, so how does this compare to other grouper? That's often a question we get. Well, they're the highest mercury concentration of any grouper, or any grouper in the Western Atlantic. And then you compare that to black grouper, the next one up. Max levels, they're 5 or 6 times that, but they're higher than all the other grouper species that are commercialized or consumed. So that gives you a relative label for that. And then if you compare that to other commercial species outside of grouper, this is from our studies showing this. The other ones that that are advised to not consume or be sold by FDA, that all these other fish listed that are below the levels of Goliath grouper are to be avoided. So if this fishery became a consumptive fishery, they would also be in this avoided category. Again, a reason why there's no reason for it to be a fishery species. All right, so there's been a lot of documented cases, especially early on, for acute mercury toxicity. This is from Minamata, Japan, where it was coined the phrase Minamata disease from mercury toxicity, because women that were consuming fish that were laden with mercury from a river that passed that on to their offspring, and also children that were consuming mercury laden with fish laden with mercury were getting these extreme conditions: ataxia, loss of voluntary muscle control, teeth falling out, these horrible conditions. And of course, that's acute. What we're more concerned with is not as much acute, but the chronic effect of mercury consumption over time, which would be more the case with Goliath grouper. And this has been well documented in health literature, medical literature, showing the effects of mercury on humans, right? So in adults, primarily it's delayed effects, which can be up to several weeks after consumption, but it can aid or lead to nervous disorders. It's been implicated in heart disease and Alzheimer's. But of course, it's worse in children and fetuses. So it can lead to irreversible brain damage, delayed speech, etc., learning disabilities. And it's often very difficult to diagnose, which is why there's a lot of controversy over mercury, is that there's no real smoking gun. It has to be researched in order to understand it, because there's a lot of other things that can cause these same ailments. But it has been shown to cause these things. And then of course, it's worse when pregnant women eat it and pass it on to their offspring. And pregnant women can be asymptomatic after consuming high levels of mercury while they're developing. Fetus can result in extreme brain damage. So that's an important consideration. It may not affect adult men so much, but it really affects vulnerable parts of the population, right? But it's not as well known as how this affects the health of fish. Right, and I'll just skim over this, but the main things that I want to talk about in terms of methylmercury are things that we were able to measure. Fish can't talk like humans can and describe their feelings and their symptoms. So we really have to look at things that we can look at in the lab, and that's things like liver damage, histology, looking at tissues that we extract, and look at the slides to see if there's damage or disease, disrupted blood chemistry, again, like looking at their blood plasma and trying to understand how that affects their immune system and other health parameters. And of course, reduced reproductive success is an important consideration. This is from a publication that we just came out this year by our lab. And basically we found the same thing you would expect to see in humans. You see in fish that have consumed a lot of mercury. So on the left, bottom left here, I'm just showing this detail. We looked at a bunch of different tissues in mercury concentrations, so blood, muscle, and liver. We won't talk about blood and liver as much, even though the levels are very high. That's liver pretty much typically has more inorganic mercury. It's really the muscle that we want to talk about today, because that's where most of the methyl mercury lies, and also what humans consume. But in terms of health of the fish, these all contribute to what we found as a lot of adverse effects of this mercury, a lot of correlative things showing that blood analytes, immune system parameters, oxidative stress, all kinds of things that aid in poor health are highly correlated with these high levels of mercury we found in them. We also looked at their liver tissue, where most of the mercury was, or the inorganic mercury, high levels of mercury, and found significant impacts to their liver tissue. Another study has shown tissue damage and disease potential from this too. Almost more importantly, is similar to humans that are more susceptible in their reproductive stage, so their offspring. We find some of the highest levels reported in gametes, so their eggs and their sperm, occur in Goliath grouper. Extremely high levels. In fact, if you put that same line of EPA risk level on eggs and sperm, they are their average is above that line, so you wouldn't even be able to eat these. And of course, comparing that to laboratory studies that have been done shows that they're off-putting a ton of this mercury into their eggs, and that has a high potential for reproductive effects, so their offspring not becoming viable or surviving. So that really has an effect potentially on their population. So that leads then into number 3, which is into adult population is limited. So that recruitment, again, is the new individuals, the larvae becoming juveniles, and then eventually making their way into the reproductive population. And if we hone in on why this is important, well, we have sustained mangrove habitat loss, which is their essential habitat throughout the world. But in Florida, this is just one example I put up here. We've lost up to 50% of the world's mangroves in county, and in Lake Worth and other places, sometimes almost 100%. So coming back to Florida, that southwest part of Florida, where most of the mangroves, good intact mangrove habitat still lies just in that one region. A lot of the rest of Florida doesn't have, even though there are some mangroves that exist, there aren't good habitat for Goliath grouper. Right. So the point being that even if reproductive output is high, mangrove losses could affect population recovery. All right, and then on top of that, there's all these other events that have been happening. You've probably seen them in the news. There's been multiple historical cold water events that have dropped to low levels to the point where it created fish kills. And of course, the last 5 years or so, we've had repeated red tide events. And then you've seen these pictures of Goliath grouper and other manatees and dolphins and things washing up on beaches, dying from these human intensified red tide events, right? This one from this year, another fish kill. There's been numerous others in recent years. This is one from the St. Lucie power plant, the intake pipe that pulls in all these fish turtles and other things, sharks, into their tanks, and then removes them from the population. But also there's fish kills that happen periodically. So in a population that's recovering and already not doing well, these kills of their reproductive population is detrimental. All right, so there was that recent FWC commissioner meeting that I had mentioned. There was some data they showed that's a little bit questionable, and I bring this up because we're really concerned with the population recovering. And this figure here was pulled from their presentation, and it shows more or less what I've been talking about. If you follow this from early on, say from the early years on the x-axis, you see this increase in their population, and then you see this cutoff. So then I should mention the top part of this figure is juvenile surveys and abundance metrics, and the bottom is adults. So you see a similar pattern with both. You see this increase as they recover, but then in recent years, you see this huge drop off on both adults and juveniles due to cold events, red tide. We know poaching exists. There's a number of reasons why this is happening. And so this is really why we're concerned with any potential for reopen a fishery, it's just their populations are not doing well, and on top of mercury and these other things. So what FWC is pointing to is this last part of this figure where there's this uptick in the last year or so, in the last year, in juveniles and adults. Well, the creel surveys are pretty well organized, and that would show an increase here, and then those are recreational fishery reportings. But if that were true and we saw this uptick, then in juveniles, you wouldn't see an increase in the adult population for about 5 or 6 years after that. Remember, their life cycle is so where they don't add to the adult population until at least 6 or 7 years after their juvenile phase. So you wouldn't actually see an increase in the adult population until, say, 2024 or 2023. So it's very questionable, this uptick in this recreational metric here that they're pointing to reopen this fishery. And the reason it's questionable is because other data that we have from dive data that has been standardized and worked with by multiple individuals. This is Reef Data. This is collected citizen science data, same as the other data that FWC showed, but this is from divers versus recreational fishers. And this shows an actual decline in their population as well. And so up through 2020, even now. In the Keys and on the East Coast. And in the Gulf of Mexico, this data is from a similar citizen science data set. This one isn't standardized, it's being worked on right now, but it seems to indicate a similar decline on the Gulf Coast, showing that downslope of those bars. Right. So population is not actually doing well, despite what FWC is promoting. And so that's another big reason why we're saying that the best available science is showing that it's not a good fishery species. Okay, lastly, is there viable alternative economic considerations that have not been addressed by the commission in terms of opening up fishery? And this is important because you've maybe heard this slogan said, but it's important to say again that Goliath grouper is vastly more valuable to Florida as an ecotourism species than as a fishery species. In other words, it's more valuable alive than it is dead. And so this is really that shift in paradigm from a fisheries species that is extracted for harvest to be consumed versus a fishery or a non-fishery where divers enjoy it, and even a recreational fishery where the fish is not killed in the end. And where this has, and this is from a study done by Jeff Scheidler and Pierce in 2016, which has shown that actually a lot more economic revenue can be made by keeping these fish alive as well. So divers are willing to pay up to $300 to see and photograph a school of Goliath grouper, and also the catch and release charters that are targeting these things versus a one-time consumptive thing that could be very detrimental to the population. And this is recurring revenue. Right. So, and then there's also indirect revenues, people flying from around the world to come to visit these dive sites and even to catch them. So you've got restaurants, hotels, transportation, all kinds of other tourist attractions and things that can really aid to the economy, which has not really been assessed in terms of how much this is productive for an economical benefit to the state. And that really needs to be looked at in more detail. Because there's a lot more money to be made in keeping them alive. And this is just one example from a dive shop. There's every diver and dive shop around here will have similar figures and anecdotes, basically showing, this is from Jerry Carroll, Jupiter Dive Center, a popular dive center here, showing that revenue has increased as have number of divers coming to their dive shops since Goliath grouper have been protected and their populations have rebounded. So there's a direct tie between how dive shops are doing in this region with Goliath grouper being in the area. And these are really the biggest group of advocates for keeping this fishery or keeping this fish in good condition. And then lastly, it's been shown with other species, not just Goliath grouper, through other protections. Sharks are a big one, and rays as a lucrative business. So in host countries like the Bahamas, it's bringing in hundreds of millions of dollars where predators like sharks have been protected, and they're used as a dive or a non-consumptive economic boon than consuming them. So it shows that this is really the direction that we should go with Goliath grouper and continue to go in. Goliath grouper dive tourism is available only in Florida year round. and it's past during spawning time. So it's really Florida. We're the ones that are responsible for this population. If it hasn't rebounded in Brazil, it hasn't rebounded throughout the rest of its range. We are the ones responsible for their entire population, and it's our responsibility to keep it moving in that direction. So I know we're running a bit late with everything going on. This is a quick video from that was produced by Jean-Michel Cousteau. You should all know the Cousteau name, and this was made from the letter that we wrote, and that was signed by John and Kathleen as well, and then by the Cousteaus. And he made this video, and I want to try to show this, and if it crashes, I'm done. But this is the last slide here, so I think we can probably show this. And I'm going to stop sharing that screen so that I can share this one. And then I'm done. So enjoy this short video. Can't see it?
It's still on your PowerPoint, I think.
Okay, then I'm gonna do this. And do this. Minimize that.
Yep.
Now we good?
Yes.
Okay, here we go.
Goliath groupers, fish that can reach 8 feet long and weigh 800 pounds, are treasures that we must protect for ocean health and for the benefit of future generations. Goliath groupers were fished to near extinction until federal and state laws protected them in 1990. Their population began to recover, but now there are people who want to begin fishing them again. Reopening the Goliath grouper fishery is a terrible idea. We must protect them in perpetuity, like we do with turtles, manatees, dolphins, and whales. It's no longer appropriate for people to take these magnificent fish for their personal pleasure or for food. Plus, their flesh is unhealthy to eat. It's now known that Goliath groupers have dangerously high levels of mercury in their flesh that is harmful to humans. The notion that Goliath grouper populations are increasing is not supported with science. Their recovery has been stalled by mortality events caused by red tide and historic cold weather, as well as a loss of quality mangrove habitat necessary for their young. And their high mercury levels are affecting their reproduction and repopulations. Our economy will benefit the most by preserving these fish for ecotourists that want to take their picture. The ocean will benefit because it will help this fragile ecosystem to recover. And future generations will benefit because they have a right to healthy oceans. Please protect Goliath groupers in perpetuity. It's the right thing to do. Thank you very much.
So that is a nice summary of the talk that I gave. I think he kind of wraps all that up. You can see a lot of the slides and information that we worked with to provide Jean-Michel. So I thought he did a very nice job at that summary. So with that, take it over. Hopefully that.
Yes.
that
Thank you so much. And I don't think I had seen that that piece at the end yet. So that was a nice addition. Thank you.
Well-
Before we get to questions, I'm just going to direct folks to where they can find the recording if you're still listening live, or if you want to listen to more past DCP programs, you can head straight to our website, dolphincommunicationproject.org, and look under that education tab. You'll find our webinars there. You can also find them on our YouTube channel, now cleverly titled Dolphin Communication Project. And if that isn't enough for you, you can access our podcast, the Dolphin Pod, hosted by Dr. Justin Gregg and Laura Teasdale. And it's a pretty entertaining way to get a dose of dolphin science, and it's available wherever you get your podcasts. Our deep dives and dolphin lessons are going to continue. We will update our website and social media with future talks. The deep dives are in-depth presentations, generally geared toward kind of high school and up, with Q&A at the end. And then dolphin lessons are geared more towards elementary students and the young at heart, and they're shorter presentations with Q&A as well. And of course, we would not be a good nonprofit organization if we didn't let you know how you can support us. We are pleased to offer these free educational programs, but of course, we rely on our supporters to keep things going. You can support us by doing things like adopting a wild dolphin. You can become a member, make a donation, snag a t-shirt, usually around the holiday times. You can join us in the field, and you can support us through your shopping, things like Amazon Smile, snag a Wanderer bracelet, or get your sunscreen from Stream to Sea. And of course, please do stay in touch. You can see our website there and all of our social media that we're trying to stick with. So thank you, a huge thank you to Chris, and we will get to questions.
Well, and any follow-up
you.
questions that come after this are from people that watch the recorded version. You can give my contact you have, and people can contact me directly. A lot of people always want to know what they can do to help.
Yes.
That, and we can get into that a little.
That was actually one of our questions, so we can start there if you want. And the question was kind of specifically, what can scuba divers do to help? If that's kind of a voice that collectively can make a difference. But really, I would extend that to anyone listening. What do you recommend that they do?
So it's tough, and this question comes up quite often. You know, the way that these commissioner hearings work are difficult to really voice your opinion, but you know, it really is going to these meetings. If you can, they're virtual right now, and joining in, you can give 3-minute points, right? You can call in and give some sort of a response. You can email FWC, and then there's an address for that, to give your opinion about it. Those are the most direct ways to contact FWC. There are change.org petitions going around right now. One main one that have over 75,000 signatures. That may have, I know FWC is aware of that, so that may have some potential for change. A lot of it is really just being louder than the people that are voicing their opinion. So, you know, my effort here is to try to get the science out there so that people have what they need to then direct their comments at the people making these decisions. That's really my purpose here, other than just educating. So, you know, that's why the people, you know, we want to give that information to people that can speak louder over the people that are trying to open up a fishery based on misperception and things like that. You know, and then there's a broader issue, which is the way that a lot of these commissions are really organized, and they're political appointees that you may or may not agree with, and they're non-scientists, and they don't really have much of a science background. And you know, a lot of them have vested interest in real estate or things, or a lot of the wealthier people in that fish in this case that have their ear, that you know, that want to see Goliath grouper taken out for non-science reasons that don't benefit the entire economy or the ecosystem. So it's really trying to, the broader perspective is we need to change the way that these systems are are developed, and part of it is, you know, voting, you know, of course, for politicians that are going to appoint the correct people to the commission that are more science and ecosystem conservation minded on a broader scale. You can call your politicians congressmen, that sort of thing. You know, that's a spiel that everybody is gonna, you know, be kind of bored by, but there are things you can do on the ground, and then there's bigger issues that we're trying to fight as scientists, and it's really the organization of how these decisions are being made and handed down that I think needs to change overall.
And in terms of the worth more alive than caught once and dead, are they actually a good catch and release species in the sense that, do they survive that trauma? Or is it like, well, catch and release is better than catch and consume?
Well, more the latter, of course. You know, everybody, I guess, considers that they have some right to these resources. So from a non-consumptive thing, is much better than a consumptive, obviously. And if done well and done right, you know, these fish can do pretty well once they're released. You know, I know how to do it right.
Mm-hmm.
And then we know what to do, but is that fishermen necessarily doing it right? You know, we see tons of videos and stuff of Goliath Grouper. We pull them up from the depths. Their swim bladders, the thing that they use for buoyancy in the water column. If you pull that up, they expand. The air, the gas actually expands in that bladder, and then they float to the surface. They can't control that rapid ascent, and so what we do is we use a venting tool, and we release that gas so that they can then swim back down to the bottom. If that's not done properly, if it's not done in the right location, it can cause a lot of harm to the fish. It can create these predation events. There's been some YouTube videos showing hammerheads eating Goliath grouper. Well, that's because they were floating at the surface and they can't protect themselves. So
Easy targets.
easy targets. So overall, yes, it's better, and I'm not advocating or the opposite of that, but it is better than you know, consuming them. But you know, that's been going on forever, and that's still not appeasing the audience or the stakeholders that want to see them dead for consumption, or because they hate them and want to kill them. That there's an emotional, angry response to. So there's no perfect solution, but yes.
In the vein of no perfect solution, has there been proposals, or maybe this is what FWC is working on now, where there would be a limited fishery that protected the spawning aggregations but allowed for fishing outside of those times and places? Is that like a stepping stone, or would that do more harm than good?
The issue with that, well, first of all, this population is not doing well. So any take at this point, any further loss is going to be damaging to the recovery, whether it's from red tide events, whether it's from these limited fishery that they're proposing. The biggest problem is enforcement. We see this throughout their global extent. So Brazil, Caribbean, they're protected, but the enforcement is zero. And so they're basically, they're not able to recover in those areas, somewhat because of that. There's habitat and other reasons too. It's not, these fish move around, they come to these spawning aggregations, but they move around. You can't say, let's fish this site, not that site during the spawning season. It just doesn't work that way. These fish are moving around, and enforcement's not good enough to really do this. We'll have an issue like we did with the black bear hunt, where, there's a ton of damage done before FWC can stop these fish from being killed or hunted. And then there's the other side of this, where they're trying to limit the size range of the fish that's being targeted. Well, what's going to happen there is fishermen are going to go out, they're going to catch every fish they possibly can, and I showed you how easy they are to catch. And then people are going to be like, nope, not that one, and they're going to release it. Nope, not that one, they're going to release it. And that is the issue with, if they're not properly handled, you could see a huge mortality that's not being recorded. So I don't see any way that we can really have a limited harvest that can really support a recovering population.
The next one, I've kind of lumped together several people's questions, so I'm going to throw like a bunch at you, and then you can kind of pick from it. One person was asking about during, I believe, when they were protected, was illegal fishing significant enough during that time that it was an issue, even though you saw recovery? And maybe actually I'll pause at that and then I'll ask the other bunch together.
Okay, so, well, they are currently protected. That was not
Oh,
part
they're
of
still.
that. So 1990 through current, they're protected still. There's been a lot of pressure on FWC to reopen the fishery. Yes, we know poaching is happening a lot, and actually I'm going to kick myself because I had images I was going to put in this presentation from a prominent fisherman. If any of you know Don DeMaria, he sent me of spears through the heads of Goliath grouper that were still alive, but were clearly targeted as poaching. And we also know that there's been dead fish that have been poached and observed. So we know a lot of poaching is going on. And that's again unreported loss from the population. So yeah, that's another concern, and those are probably people that are either naive or more likely they're angry and they're taking this in their own hands because they don't think the fish should be here.
So now I have to reframe this next question a little bit, because we were thinking, I think, that like the fishery had opened and we were forgetting that it's just proposed to be opened. If they are fished commercially, will they be sold as Goliath grouper, or will they be one of those fish that's labeled either incorrectly, intentionally, or even unintentionally just for marketing?
So good question. So it's unlikely they will ever be open for commercial harvest, which is on a large scale. I can't see any scenario where they would open this up to commercial harvest. The proposal is for recreational, so individuals that can go out and have a raffle or something where they can get a tag and go out just like they do for other large species. So that is the case with that. Did I answer the full question?
Yep, I think so. And then
so right now what we're in the stage of is the May meeting. The commission has requested from their staff that they develop a proposal to then bring back to them, which is likely to happen in October, with a proposal for how this limited fishery will look. So they're moving forward with the idea of a limited fishery, and they've asked staff to come back with what that's going to look like, and then they will vote on whether or not that happens. And that should be open to the public soon, and then they're going to move fast with probably having another meeting. That's what I've heard. But yeah, but I will add to this that the whole thing of mislabeled fish that makes its way into the market, that is what's happening in other countries. I was just in Brazil last year, and we were walking through fish markets, and you see these big fillets that are this big labeled as something other than Goliath grouper because it's illegal there. But they get around it because they don't have the same regulations we have in this country, where anything can be sold as a fillet, and they can label it whatever. And of course, in restaurants, you don't know what it is. And there's research that's gone into looking at the genetics of fish that come out of the table, and it's not what they say it is. And that happens in our country too, not necessarily the Goliath grouper, but it happens with other species. So yes, in other countries, we do have a good regulatory body that allows that does channel. Like a Goliath grouper could never make its way into a restaurant or a commercial. This is all going to be individualistic recreation.
And then in terms of even at the recreational level, I don't know if you've had one. Like, do they taste really good? If they have so much mercury, why do people even want to eat them? And then tied to that, is there any consideration from, I guess, FWC, but in human health in the fishing bans? Like, meaning despite pressure from fishers, could the government forbid fishing of a species that would be too dangerous to consume? Or is that not possible on the recreational level?
So I have not had Goliath grouper. It's never been a temptation to me working on looking at their high concentrations of mercury, and it would be illegal for me to eat it. So I have not, but before 1990, I've talked to a lot of fishermen who did commercially harvest. It was commercially harvested before 1990, and people loved it. I guess it was a staple of especially in Key West. I guess it was like grouper and black beans or something like that. But Yeah, I don't know. It's a large fish. I would imagine usually with, smaller fish might taste better. So the juveniles, the juveniles might be able to sustain more of a harvest than the adults, but that doesn't appease the people that hate the adults and their interaction on reefs. So I don't think FWC is going to go for the juveniles and the mangroves. They're really trying to target the adults. We might have another conversation if they want to target juveniles. But again, none of the population should be fished. I'm not advocating for that. So in terms of legality, the FDA, I showed that line as 1 part per million. They are the ones that regulate the legal sale of fish in terms of how they would regulate mercury entering into the world of food and in the market. And they would be the only ones that have the legal say to keep it from coming into the market. But of course, this is a recreational fishery, so that is not really of concern. The Department of Health, Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, their power is just in setting levels and limits and recommendations. They can't legally say you can't eat this or you can eat this. So it really comes down to recommendations, and that's the big concern. Is it's the vulnerable people in our population that may not know better. If Joe goes and catches one of these fish and then feeds it to his friends and family because these fish are so big, what are you going to do with hundreds of pounds of meat? You're going to give it to people. People aren't going to know where it comes from, and they're not going to care. They're just going to be like, oh, I get to eat this and whatever. And that might be the concern, right? It's the unknowing people that would be potentially harmed by it.
Yeah.
So
leading to regulation. Do we have you for a few more minutes?
yeah.
Because there are still more questions. It seems crazy to think that these two things could be happening concurrently, but while the FWC is pursuing a potential fishery, could it be listed as an endangered species again? Or are they now doing too well for that?
So I forgot to comment on your last question as well, which I'll hit before I get to that. You also mentioned, like, what is the FWC? What is their obligation to report mercury levels or whatever? Every time that we have presented this information to them, they have not read the commission. Staff is doing their job. It's the commission that we're really concerned with, the non-scientists. We have published papers on everything I presented to you today. We wrote it, we condensed it into a small paper that was easily condensed. We're only given 3 minutes to give our comments, just like the rest of the public. So they don't even want to hear from non-staff scientists. They don't want to hear it because we oppose what they want to do. The commissioners, and I won't name names, but specific commissioners have multiple times when we've tried to provide them with this information, blatantly have said they don't believe that mercury is an issue, and that is their main stance on it. They don't care. They just don't care. It's not their concern. They're concerned. And one of them has said blatantly that his whole life he hasn't had any issues, so therefore it's not an issue. Well, I told you that adult men are not necessarily the vulnerable parts of the population. It's heart disease and Alzheimer's and things that have been attributed to it. Not a smoking gun, but certainly it's contributed to those ailments. But it's not of concern to these men that are primarily on the commission. So that's that point. So they've mostly ignored those data. What was the second question again? I got on myself.
About whether or not it would be added back to the environmental, the endangered species list.
Yeah, so their movements right now, there's a lot of discussion surrounding what to do right now. There's a lot of red tape that needs to get passed to get anything on the Endangered Species Act on that list. So that would probably, that's at the federal level, not the state level, and that. Yes, the population was doing well. I showed those growth curves up until the last 10 years or so. And so that this all needs to be really reconsidered. And we are, and I'm on the specialist committee for grouper and wrasse and IUCN, and we're going to have this discussion again about how the species is listed on IUCN as a global thing. That doesn't necessarily translate into the Endangered Species Act, but it would be more reason to potentially put it on there. So I'd say it's not off the table if this population continues to go down the way it has, which I really don't, I think that might help with the situation of opening up for a fishery, but you don't really want a species to be on the Endangered Species Act list because that means it's not doing well. And the whole purpose is to try to help this species out. But if that's the only thing that can be done to keep it from being fished, then maybe that is the direction to go in. And then I think that it could be a candidate because it's not doing well these last years.
So shift, I think the last few questions have to do more about the fish themselves and their habitat. So one, are they, like you showed that map at the beginning where they historically have been in the Atlantic. Are there any in the Bahamas? Or are they really confined to the Florida side of the Gulf Stream?
There, individuals will end up in the Bahamas. Sure, I've seen a couple there, but there's no aggregations forming there. You might see one here and there, but the Caribbean is really devoid of a lot of the individuals. The center of their abundance is primarily in South Florida on both coasts, the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic. There are some that can trickle out. French Guyana has some, but it doesn't look like they're a spawning population, just that they're there. Brazil has some, and those are really, and in Cuba, those are really the areas that have been studied to show that there are individuals there, but the spawning aggregations are primarily occurring in South Florida. There look to be some in Brazil too, that our colleagues have published, but they don't look anything like in Florida. There are very few in their aggregations, and there's very few aggregations.
Given that if we read your graph correctly, those spawning events are during hurricane season. Do you have any info on how severe weather could impact the population size or the spawning?
I believe there's actually some current research going on about that right now. There's, as far as I know, there's been nothing published on that. I think there's some ideas and some hypotheses of how hurricanes have affected water conditions that would affect then the way that these fish move, because they tolerate certain water temperatures. And so if upwelling events happen during hurricanes and things that can really move these fish into different areas if they can't tolerate the cold temperatures that come from that. But yeah, I don't think, in my knowledge, that there's any scientific backing right now for what happens during hurricanes. But I do think that some groups are looking at that right now.
And you segued nicely into what we can have as our last question, though maybe we'll try and think of something to end on an inspirational note. You've spoken.
Inspiration, yeah. We're all here talking about this and trying to make a difference. So that's the positive.
Yeah. They're sensitive to cold water events. Are they being impacted by the overall warming of the ocean?
That's a good question. Probably. I mean, there's a lot of again, that hasn't been documented, but I showed you that figure of that northern spawning aggregation that it could be. It's one theory is that they could be moving north because of warmer temperatures. We showed some slight evidence for that, but I think that is a growing body of work in the scientific community right now, is trying to understand how climate change is impacting the northern migration of the ranges of a lot of fish and other species. So it's definitely a potential, but with time and tracking these fish, we'll tell. And that's a difficult thing to study a little bit, because you can count individuals, but it's really their movement patterns, using the acoustic tags that I talked about a little bit. There are ways you can answer those questions, but a lot of years of data to really show that things are happening because of climate change. That's a lot of these things are, they're difficult to show a cause and effect, but I think that is the direction of a lot of organisms right now, and what's happened with climate change is northern migrations. That's definitely a pattern.
Well, I guess we will, Kathleen, Nicole, I don't know if anyone else has anything to add or ask or to inspire our listeners. I, for one, am grateful to Chris. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to John, Terramar Productions, for connecting us. And happy DCP has the opportunity to deviate from our dolphin-centric programming to include another really cool, really big, really fascinating creature that ought to be protected.
Some of Chris's roots were in dolphins, so it was a good fit.
Yeah,
We
so
can keep him.
I appreciate you guys bringing me in to have this discussion to a different audience. And I really thought this was going to be an intervention where you're trying to get me back to the dolphin.
On this issue.
Sounds good.
So, awesome. Thanks, everybody. And Chris
you.
can't hear our last thank yous, but thank you to everyone who joined. And we'll see you at another DCP program.
Thanks.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.